My name is Mallory Hayes. I am 35 years old, and 11 years ago, my sister Rachel left her newborn son on my doorstep and vanished. No calls, no explanation, just a baby seat with a crying infant. My parents refused to help coldly, saying, "He is your burden now." I raised my niece Ethan as my own, creating a beautiful life together. Then Rachel has suddenly returned with our parents, suing for custody, claiming I kept them apart. Today in court, I handed the judge a sealed folder. His eyes widened as he asked, "Do they even know what you have?" Before I continue my story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and hit like and subscribe if you believe real family isn't about blood, it's about who stays. I lived in the suburbs of Los Angeles, in a beige 2-bedroom duplex off Magnolia where the jacarandas make purple snow in May. I worked day shifts at a neighborhood clinic in Burbank, vaccines, blood pressure checks, a steady stream of worried parents and stubborn grandpas, and I was dating a guy who kept dropping hints about ring sizes and weekend trips to Napa. His name was Drew. He'd started saving photos of vineyards on Instagram and once paused in front of a jewelry store long enough for me to notice his reflection trembling in the glass. I thought my life was about to tilt toward normal, marriage, a bigger apartment, maybe a dog. But I didn't know another kind of family was already hurtling toward me. It was a rain streak Thursday, the kind that turns the 101 into an aquarium and makes the tires hiss like snakes. I got home late, shoes soaked, scrub top clinging to my back. The porch light sputtered once and then held. As I fumbled for my keys, I heard it, a thin, watery cry, the kind that curls into your bones before your brain catches up. I turned, and there he was, an infant carrier set squarely on my welcome mat, rain beating on the handle, a tiny knit cap pulled low over a forehead the shape of a teardrop. For a second I froze, the way you do when you're sure you're misunderstanding reality. Then I crouched. The baby's cheeks were blotchy from crying, his hands clenched into little shells, his breaths hitching. The carrier blanket was damp but warm. Tucked beneath his shoulder was a folded note, the paper wrinkled and soft, as if someone had sweated through their courage holding it. The handwriting was unmistakable, loopy R's, a tilt to the left. Rachel. I unfolded it with shaking fingers. His name is Ethan. I can't handle this. Take care of him. 3 sentences. No explanation, no phone number, no I'm sorry. Just a name and an order that felt like a trapdoor opening beneath my life. My training kicked in. I checked his color, his breath, the rise and fall of his chest. 3 months old at most, soft fontanelle, a milky smell, the way his eyes landed on nothing and everything. "Hey, Ethan," I whispered, though the name made my throat ache. "I've got you. I've got you." I lifted the whole seat inside, set it on the kitchen table, and laid a dish towel over the damp blanket. I turned the oven to low to take the chill off the air and stood there, hands braced against laminate, listening to the rain tick against the window and the timid squeaks coming from a barely there mouth. I called my parents first, because that's what you do when a bomb goes off. You dial the people who taught you where to stand. My mother answered on the second ring, TV noise buzzing behind her. I didn't even get through the first sentence before her voice hardened like a door slamming. "Don't even think about passing this off on us. This is your problem." "No, where's Rachel?" "No, is the baby okay?" Just that. Then the line went quiet long enough for me to hear my own breath. My father didn't get on the phone. He never does when the conversation might require a spine. I stared at the tile, at the water pooling beneath the carrier, and called Drew. He said he would come over, and for a moment I let myself picture us as a team, 2 adults in a small kitchen improvising parenthood with YouTube videos and seat-of-the-pants tenderness. He arrived with his hood up and his eyes already wary, like he could feel the weight of a decision pressing on the threshold. "That's Rachel's kid?" he asked, glancing at the note like it might bite him. I nodded, and Ethan squeaked again, that small pleading sound that makes your chest want to crack open. Drew took a half step back. "Mallory, I am not doing this," he said, voice tight. "I am not going to become a stepfather because of someone else's mistake." He lifted his hands like a referee calling a foul, looked at me like there must be a hidden camera somewhere, and then said he needed space to think. He grabbed the umbrella he'd propped by the door, hesitated like he might say something kinder, then left. The door clicked shut with the polite finality of an elevator. The apartment felt suddenly too bright, like the overhead light was interrogating me. I turned it off and switched on the lamp by the couch. Shadows softened the room. I knelt beside the carrier and touched Ethan's fist with one finger. He uncurled just enough to grip me. My body flooded with heat and terror at the same time. The clock on the microwave read 9:42. The rain was still steady. Somewhere downstairs, my neighbor's TV laughed at a joke. I wanted to call Rachel and say all the things that were thudding inside my head. How could you? Where are you? Why me? But the last number I had for her had been dead for months, every text bouncing back. I wanted to call my mother again, demand decency, but I could still hear her sentence hanging in the air like a warning sign. So I did the only thing left. I moved. I found a clean bath towel and warmed it in the dryer, then draped it over Ethan's blanket to help chase the chill away. I wiped his face with a damp cloth. He calmed at the rhythm of it, as if the certainty of gentle repetition could substitute for a mother's heartbeat. I heated water for tea I would never drink and held my mug for warmth while I sang the only lullaby I could remember, the one about the mockingbird and the diamond ring that always felt more like a threat than a promise. He fell asleep in shivers and starts, lids fluttering, mouth opening and closing like he was catching dreams. I didn't dare move him, so I pulled a chair close and watched the rise and fall of his chest. Outside, the rain slowed to a hush. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded. The oven clicked off. I turned out the lamp and sat in the half-dark, listening to a stranger breathe and feeling the last version of my life receding like a tide. The proposal I had been bracing for vanished in the same quiet way the umbrella had slipped from Drew's hand. My parents' voices echoed in the corners, and my sister's handwriting glowed on the table like a dare. I grabbed my keys with hands that wouldn't stop trembling and buckled the infant carrier into the passenger seat the way I remembered from discharge instructions at the clinic. The rain had thinned to a mist, but my knuckles were slick on the steering wheel. At 11:47 p.m., the streets of our neighborhood felt hollowed out, vacant bus stops, closed to carry us, a laundromat light buzzing behind its steel gate. I drove toward the only 24-hour supermarket I knew, the one-off Victory where the aisles smell like bleach and melon rinds after midnight. Inside, the fluorescent lights felt like an X-ray of my fear. I pushed a cart with one hand and cradled the carrier in the other, the wheels thudding at every cracked tile. My brain tried to sort a universe of decisions I had never expected to make: powder or ready to feed, size 1 or newborn, slow flow nipple or medium. I stared at cans lined like soldiers: gentle, sensitive, soy, hypoallergenic, labels promising calm stomachs and happy sleep. I picked gentle because the word sounded like what both of us needed. Diapers next. A wall of pastel boxes, grinning babies who looked better rested than anyone I knew. Size 1, I guessed, and tossed in wipes, rash cream, a cheap thermometer. Bottles, 2 small ones with tiny blue vents that claimed to reduce colic. A pack of burp cloths, the thin kind you can wash 1,000 times. Pacifiers because the silence between cries made me frantic. I slid everything onto the belt, trying not to do the math of the total or the future. The cashier glanced at the carrier and then at me, the way people do when they don't want to ask the question. "Late night," she said softly. I nodded. The register spit out a long receipt and my hands shook so badly that the paper rattled like wind. Back home, the apartment smelled like rain and laundry detergent. I boiled water for the bottles, read the instructions on the formula 3 times, and still measured the first scoop twice. Ethan whimpered, that hiccuping pre-cry that scrapes your heart from the inside. I whispered, "Almost there, baby," to keep from crying with him. We didn't have a bassinet, so I pulled our white plastic laundry basket from the closet, lined it with folded towels, and layered a soft blanket on top. I tucked another blanket around his legs, careful to leave space around his face the way we were taught. Improvised crib, improvised mother. The bottle was warm against my wrist, the milk the color of fog. He latched clumsily, then found a rhythm, his throat working in tiny swallows that made me stupidly proud. We both stared at each other like we'd been told a joke we didn't quite understand. I wiped his mouth with the back of my hand and laughed once, shaky, surprised, before the enormity of everything pressed back down. When he finally slept, I set the basket beside the couch and called the police because it seemed like the responsible thing, like telling the universe I wasn't going to pretend this was normal. The dispatcher's voice sounded tired in a human way, not a bureaucratic one. An officer called back 20 minutes later and asked a few questions. Was the baby hurt? Did I know the mother? Was he left with a stranger? I explained about the note and my sister. He cleared his throat, and I could hear the shrug in his voice even before the words arrived. The mother left the child with family, so there's no crime. He told me to keep the note, to call again if anyone tried to remove the baby by force, and to contact child services in the morning for guidance. The line clicked and left me with the hum of the fridge and the soft, uncertain breaths of a person who didn't know he had been abandoned. I sat on the floor, back to the couch, knees drawn up like a teenager, and watched him sleep. The basket made small sounds when he shifted, wicker creaks that felt intimate and ancient. My phone buzzed, Drew's name lighting the screen, then stopped. I didn't answer. I couldn't bear another voice telling me I was on my own. The clock pushed past 2 a.m. I Googled how many ounces a 3-month-old should drink, what color a healthy diaper looks like, how to tell if a baby is cold. I set an alarm for 3 hours and slept in bursts, the kind of sleep where your ears stay awake. Every squeak turned into a question. When the alarm rang, I changed him awkwardly on a bath towel, overfolded the diaper tabs, and apologized to a person who couldn't judge me. He blinked at me seriously, like he was already keeping score. At dawn, the rain had rinsed the city into a dull silver. I showered in 3 minutes, dressed in clean scrubs because they were the only clothes that made sense, and strapped the carrier into the back seat this time, the right way, Googled between feedings. The courthouse opened at 8. I had been there before for jury duty and parking tickets, never for a life. The lobby smelled like coffee and wet paper. A security guard nodded at the carrier and pointed me to the family law window without making me say why I was there. The clerk handed me a stack of forms thicker than the formula manual. Petition for temporary guardianship. Emergency orders. Declaration. I filled in lines with ink that smeared where my hand shook. Relationship to minor? Aunt. Whereabouts of parents? Unknown. Immediate risk? I wrote the truth. Abandoned at my door. Mother unreachable. I attached a copy of the note and, because something in me was already learning, I took photos of everything on my phone and emailed them to myself. A bailiff directed me to a gray bench outside a courtroom where doors exhaled people who looked both relieved and ruined. Ethan woke and snuffled, and I fed him while balancing the bottle in the crook of my elbow so I could sign the last boxes. A woman with a badge asked if I had legal counsel. I said I had a job and a baby and a sister who left a note. She softened and told me a judge would review it today if possible. Time rearranged itself into a slow drip. When the clerk finally reappeared, she handed me a stamped order granting temporary custody pending a later hearing. The paper was warm from the copier and strange in its power, as if permission could be printed. Back home, the apartment felt less like an accident and more like a first draft. I set the order in a clear sleeve, slid it into a folder with a note, and put both in the top drawer as if that made us safe. Ethan slept again, mouth open, one hand fisted near his ear like a boxer between rounds. I sat on the rug beside the laundry basket crib, stroked the edge of the blanket to steady myself, and let the tears come, quiet, hot, unwilling to be reasoned with. I leaned close so my voice wouldn't wobble the air around him. Ethan, I whispered, the name tasting new and inevitable. I don't know what will happen next, but I won't let anyone hurt you. The room held the promise like a secret. While outside, the rain stopped for good. 6 months later, my life did not look like a normal life so much as a shift schedule taped to a fridge. I moved into a cheap 2-room apartment above a coin laundromat where the dryer vents breathed warm lint into the hallway. The rent fit my new budget. The thin walls did not. Nights, I worked 12 hours at the clinic, triage IVs, flu swabs at 3 a.m., the kind of medicine held together by caffeine and grace. Days, I learned the geography of waiting rooms, the courthouse on Hill Street, the child services office with chairs that pinched your thighs, the legal aid clinic with a coffee machine that hissed like a cat. I slept in patches, 30 minutes here, an hour there, my pillow always smelling like formula no matter how many times I washed the case. Ethan's crib, at first a laundry basket, gave way to an actual mattress after I found a secondhand frame online for $20 and scrubbed it until the screws shone. I lined the window with blackout curtains I cut and hemmed with fabric glue. I kept a 3-ring binder on the kitchen counter with tabs that read insurance, court, doctors, receipts, as if order were a spell I could cast over chaos. The temporary custody letter sat in front like a talisman. Every morning, before I put on my scrubs, I kissed the top of Ethan's head and repeated the docket number out loud so it would stay sharp in my mouth. My parents visited rarely and only when they could act like auditors. They stood in the doorway as if the apartment itself might stain them. My mother's eyes did a full sweep baseboards, sink, the stack of folded onesies, and then landed on my face. "You look tired," she'd say, like a diagnosis. "Maybe you should give him up to a shelter after all?" The first time I laughed because I didn't trust my voice not to splinter. The second time, I asked if she wanted to hold him. She said she had a manicure appointment. My father mostly examined his shoes and murmured something about being practical, which I decided must be a language I no longer spoke. But the building made room for us in ways they never did. Mr. Ortiz in 2B, an army vet who walked with a cane and swore that duct tape and patience could fix anything, became our first ally. He showed me how to swaddle with a kitchen towel when all the clean blankets were in the wash. He knocked at odd hours with a gallon of distilled water for the humidifier and stories that turned fear into something that could sit down and listen. "Breathe with him," he'd say, tapping his chest. "Babies borrow your rhythm until they find their own." He tightened the wobbly leg on Ethan's crib, sharpened my dull scissors, and taught me to rock the stroller over the lobby threshold without waking a sleeping child, a veteran's version of a magic trick. At the clinic, my colleagues built a soft net under us. One afternoon between patients, they strung paper cranes in the break room and pushed together 2 folding tables. Someone baked a sheet cake from a box and piped "Welcome, Ethan" in crooked blue letters. They called it a mini baby shower because nobody had time for a real one and chipped in cash for a new crib that arrived in 2 flat boxes with instructions written in 7 languages. After my shift, 3 nurses and the phlebotomist came home with me to assemble it. We ate pizza from paper plates while untangling Allen wrenches and tiny screws that tried to escape through the floorboards. When we finished, we stood there longer than necessary, looking at the crib like a small cathedral we'd erected by faith. Ethan learned night from day by degrees, his cries shifting from alarm to opinion. I learned to do the math of diapers and overtime. The clinic scheduler started handing me night shifts because I stopped rejecting them. On my nights off, my body still woke at 1 a.m. expecting a call light. I kept formula cans lined up like soldiers and stashed pacifiers in every room like emergency exits. Drew returned once with a key in a plain envelope and a speech he had practiced on the drive over. He said I was doing an amazing thing and that he respected me, which is what people say when they want permission to disappear without being the villain. He didn't touch the crib. He looked at the binder and blinked like the tabs might bite. I listened, nodded, and then I walked him back to the door. After he left, I stood with my forehead against the cool wood and waited to feel ruined. But nothing collapsed. The future I'd once pictured, vineyards, rings, Sunday brunches with in-laws, disintegrated the way a movie set does when someone turns on the work lights. What remained looked smaller, plainer, and inexplicably more real. Loss came in tiny negotiations. I sold the soft leather handbag I'd saved up for, along with the shoes I wore to dinners that now felt like a life I had borrowed. I canceled the Napa weekend I'd kept on my calendar like a superstition. There were nights when I cried in the shower so Ethan wouldn't absorb the frequency of it, and mornings when I laughed out loud at the absurdity of warming bottles in a coffee mug because the microwave died and payday was still 4 days away. And yet under the exhaustion, something steady formed. A new goal arrived not with trumpets, but with checklists, shots up to date, WIC appointment, pediatrician follow-up, rent on time, court papers filed before the deadline. I wanted the kind of life where Ethan's first word would not have to be sorry. When I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and hardly recognized the woman with the dark crescents under her eyes, I counted the things I could trust: my hands, my training, my stubbornness. One evening, as the sun burned out behind the laundry sign and the hallway filled with the metallic hum of quarters dropping, Mr. Ortiz knocked and handed me a small, battered baby monitor from his daughter's attic. "I figured you could use a second set of ears," he said. I wanted to tell him I already had a second set, that motherhood had turned my hearing into a weather system, but I took the monitor and thanked him. Later, after Ethan fell asleep, I sat on the edge of my bed with the monitor between my knees and listened to the soft static of a life I was learning to carry. My old dreams left quietly, like last guests at a party who know the dishes still have to be washed. In their place, one clear sentence remained: make it safe for him. It wasn't glamorous and it didn't post well, but it was desirable and worthy in a way that finally made sense. 5 years flew by unnoticed. Not because nothing happened, but because everything did quietly: one packed lunch, one school pickup, one sticky bedtime story at a time. The apartment above the laundromat became less temporary and more ours. I learned which window caught the first square of morning sun that would land perfectly on Ethan's blanket fort like a spotlight. The binder on the counter kept its place, but my life was no longer only documents and deadlines. It was breakfasts with cut strawberries, lost library books, and a pair of little sneakers that always seemed to hide under the couch. I got a job as a school nurse so I could be closer to Ethan's schedule. It meant a pay cut, but the trade was hours instead of money, bells instead of beepers, playground scrapes instead of 3 a.m. emergencies. My office smelled like hand sanitizer and crayons. From my tiny window, I could see the swings and the line for the slide. At 12:10, I'd watch Ethan's class cross the yard like a flock of bright birds. He would try to walk by without waving, pretending to be cool, then flash me a small, secret smile that felt like a handshake no one else could see. I stocked Band-Aids with superhero prints, logged temperatures, and learned which kids needed ice for their feelings more than their bruises. Our evenings softened into traditions that made the days make sense. On Fridays, we built a fort out of blankets between the couch and the dining chairs: 2 sheets, 3 clips, and a string of thrift store fairy lights we pretended were stars. I'd pop popcorn in a pot because Ethan said the sound felt like rain on the roof, and we'd watch the same cartoon about a talking train until I could recite whole scenes by heart. He always fell asleep halfway through, his head on my arm, warm and heavy, his breath a feather against my sleeve. I'd slide out carefully and carry him to bed, then collapse onto the couch and finish the last 10 minutes alone, just to see the train home safe again. Sundays belonged to bicycles and the Santa Monica Boardwalk. We started with a clunky secondhand bike with training wheels I found at a church sale, cleaned the chain with an old toothbrush, and called it Blue Lightning because names make things brave. The first time we rode, sea air stuck to our skin like salt, and gulls argued above the pier as if they were offended by our happiness. We'd stop for churros dusted with sugar that made our fingers sparkle, then pedal to the end of the path where buskers juggled and a man blew giant iridescent bubbles that drifted over our heads like temporary planets. When Ethan finally asked me to take the training wheels off, his legs shook but his eyes didn't. He wobbled for half a block, straightened, and flew. I ran until my lungs burned, then let go. He didn't notice until the next corner. When he realized, he shouted, "I'm doing it, Mom," to the ocean, to the sky, to me. He called me Mom, sometimes as easily as breathing. The first time, I felt the word land and take root, and then I felt the responsibility of answering to it. I never lied to him about who I was. "I'm your aunt," I'd say, every time he asked, every time the school forms forced the issue. I'm the one who stayed. He tested the names like rocks in a pocket, Aunt Mallory in public, Mom at home, sometimes both in the same sentence when he was excited or scared. I learned not to correct the word when it bloomed out of him mid-laugh. It wasn't disobedience. It was attachment, a language his body had decided on. On school nights, we had our small rhythms, spelling words with magnetic letters on the fridge, reading under a lamp that hummed, arguing gently over peas. He grew in slow astonishments, front teeth gone, a cowlick that refused to be tamed, a laugh that cracked and then rebuilt itself bigger. He loved dinosaurs, then astronauts, then anything with wheels. Sometimes, in the quiet of nighttime, he'd poke his head around my doorway and climb into my bed with the solemn permission of a cat. He'd curl against me and ask the question he always saved for the dark. "Where's my real mom?" The words never got easier, but the answer learned its own muscle memory. "She couldn't take care of you back then," I'd say, keeping my voice steady, careful. "But she left you with me because she knew I could handle it." He would lie very still and think about that for a while, like he was tracing lines on a map. "So you're my real mom now?" he'd ask some nights. "I'm your aunt," I'd say gently, kissing his hair. "And I'm your always." When Ethan turned 9, the doorbell rang during a Saturday pancake morning, when the griddle was still warm and his cheeks were sugared with powdered snow. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the door to a version of my past I almost didn't recognize. Rachel stood there, well-groomed, confident, hair glossy in a way it never was before rehab was part of our vocabulary. Next to her, a man in a tailored navy suit held a polite smile like a legal brief. "Edward," she said, as if presenting a certificate. "My husband." His handshake was dry and exact, the kind of grip that collects facts as it lets go. She talked fast, as if speed could fill the years. She said she had been sober for several years, 3 years, 8 months, that she'd found a job as a marketer at a prestigious company in Century City, that she went to meetings, had a sponsor, paid her rent on time, did yoga, ate greens. Her eyes kept sliding past me toward the hallway, where Ethan's helmet hung from the coat rack like a declaration of childhood. "I want to return to my son's life," she concluded, a sentence that landed in the room and waited for oxygen. I made coffee because that's what you do when your heart needs a reason to stay put. Ethan peeked around the corner, hair sticking up, fork still in his hand. Rachel froze, then softened her shoulders the way people do when they're approaching a skittish animal. "Hi, Ethan," she said quietly, as if loudness would break something between us. He looked at me before looking at her. I nodded. He lifted a hand in the world's smallest wave, then retreated to the kitchen where he began cutting pancakes into symmetrical squares, like he could solve the problem if the edges were even. We agreed to start small. Cautious meetings, public places, exits available. Griffith Park felt neutral, wide open, and watched over by the observatory like a stone guardian. The first Sunday, we met near the carousel. Rachel brought a brown paper bag full of snacks with labels that sounded like apologies: organic, whole grain, no sugar added. Edward wore sunglasses and the expression of a man evaluating a contract, not a child. I kept my distance on the bench and let them try to find a rhythm. Ethan circled them, unsure. Children are geologists of emotion. They tap the rock until they hear the fault. Rachel talked about the turtles of the pond, the hike to the old zoo ruins, the way eucalyptus smells like clean possibilities. Ethan nodded in that solemn way he has when he is pretending to be brave. He let her push him on the swing, but his eyes kept seeking me over the arc of each pass, checking for the place where he lands. Over the next weeks, we built a schedule out of caution and weather reports. An hour on Sundays became 90 minutes. We tried the pony rides, then the playground with the shade sails that snap in the wind. Rachel brought a kite and tangled it in a tree, then laughed in a way that sounded like the girl I once knew. She knelt to tie Ethan's shoe and looked up at me with eyes shining. "Thank you," she mouthed, so small I almost didn't catch it. I wanted to believe the gratitude. I wanted to believe the 3 years, 8 months, and the whole grain snacks. Hope is a habit I've had to ration. Edward started to talk more. He asked about Ethan's school, his reading level, his pediatrician. His questions were tidy, all boxes and lines. He mentioned their 2-bedroom townhouse in Westwood, the private courtyard, the security gate. "Structure is good for kids," he said, glancing at my bike helmet dangling from the stroller handle like a counterargument. I said structure is also showing up. We smiled the way adults do when we've agreed to disagree in public. Then speed returned. The patience of the park days evaporated into a new tone I recognized from old holidays, The one where Rachel felt a decision might slip away if she didn't seize it with both hands. It was a Wednesday evening when she asked to meet at the picnic tables under the pines. Edward set his briefcase on the bench like a quiet threat. Rachel didn't ease into it. I want Ethan to live with us. He will have his own real home, a yard, trips abroad, and most importantly, both parents. The words did not echo, they thudded. Ethan, busy building a fort for his acorn army, looked up as if he'd heard a distant door slam. My mouth went dry in that old hospital way, like a code had been called and no one wanted to say it out loud. I kept my voice even. He already has a home. And a family. Rachel's jaw set, and for a moment I saw the girl who used to throw a glass of water across a room rather than admit she was thirsty. Mallory, she said, slow and bright, the voice she reserves for persuasion. I'm healthy. I'm stable. This is what's best for him. A yard, a dog, a passport full of stamps. He needs both parents. Needs, I repeated, as if the word could be examined from all sides. Needs is a warm bed and a person who wakes at the sound of your bad dreams. Needs is knowing which cup you refuse to drink from because it has the scratch on the rim. I didn't say all of that. I said, he needs continuity. He needs the truth. Edward leaned forward, voice smooth. We're offering more opportunities. More resources. I looked at Ethan, his hand full of pine sap and small victories, and thought of how the boardwalk wind lifts his hair and how he still reaches back without looking to find my hand when a crowd presses close. Opportunities aren't custody, I said. Money isn't memory. We sat there with the smell of eucalyptus and the sound of a child inventing a world at our feet. Rachel blinked fast, as if tears would be a concession. I want to be his mother, she said, barely above a whisper. You're his mother, I answered, because truth isn't afraid of its own name. But you are not the only one who loves him. And he already lives in a place where love is the first rule. Ethan glanced between us, reading the weather like sailors do. I stood, brushed the picnic dust from my jeans, and called to him that it was time to head home. He tucked his acorns into his pocket, the way he always does when he wants to carry proof that he was here. Rachel opened her mouth, one more argument, one more promise, but the moment had already chosen its shape. We walked toward the parking lot in a silence that held everything we weren't ready to say. The shift happened at my parents' dining table, the same oak surface where we'd once done homework and peeled oranges. Rachel and Edward were seated like honored guests, my mother fluttering with napkins and candles as if choreography could make this normal. Ethan sat beside me poking peas with his fork, reading the temperature the way kids do, by glances, by breaths held. When my father finally cleared his throat, he didn't look at me, he looked at Rachel. Blood is more important than anything else, he said, like he was quoting a rule carved into our family crest. Rachel deserves a second chance. The words didn't pierce so much as press, a slow crushing against the ribcage. I asked when his second chance for me would begin. No one laughed. It turned out they had been secretly in contact with her for several years and knew where she lived. The confession arrived casually, slipped between the roast and the rolls. My mother said she hadn't wanted to burden me with false hope, as if the truth would have been heavier than this. She had pictures on her phone, Rachel at a coffee shop, Rachel with a chipper sponsor at a picnic, Rachel in a tidy apartment with a ficus and white curtains. My father nodded, weary and righteous. We were waiting to see if it stuck, he said, meaning sobriety. We wanted to protect Ethan. I stared at their hands, their plates, the perfect rim of gravy, and thought of all the times I had called asking for help while they studied these secret updates and said nothing. I wrapped dinner up quickly after that, because fury and children's bedtimes do not mix. On the drive home, Ethan stared out the window and asked if Rachel would come to his next soccer game. I told him maybe. I didn't tell him that my stomach was a fist. A month later, the fist landed. A thick envelope arrived by certified mail, my name misspelled by one letter, like a small insult to precision. Inside was a notice that Rachel had filed a lawsuit to regain her parental rights. The legal language marched with indifferent certainty. Petition, prayer for relief, best interests of the child. I read it 3 times on the kitchen counter, the laminate warming under my palms. I had known it was coming, Edward's tidy questions, the way Rachel's hope had hardened into plan, but the paper made it real in a way even a doorbell couldn't. Ethan started waking in the middle of the night, frightened by dreams he couldn't describe. He would pad down the hallway and hover, as if stepping over the threshold of my room might make the fear true. One night he crawled under my blanket and whispered, so close I felt the words more than heard them, "Mom, are they going to take me away?" The word mom cracked me open and stitched me together in the same breath. I pulled him closer. "I won't let them," I said, and only when he fell asleep did I let myself feel how big a promise it was. I hired a private investigator because the ground had shifted and I needed facts that didn't wobble. A coworker's cousin gave me a name, Alvarez, retired LAPD, a man who wore his tie like a suggestion and took his coffee black. We met in a booth at a strip mall diner with cracked red vinyl seats that stuck to the back of my knees. He listened without interrupting, then slid a small notepad toward me. "Give me everything you've got," he said. I handed over copies of the petition, the note from years ago, the few old addresses I had for Rachel. He tapped the paper with a blunt finger. "Husband's a lawyer," he said. "He'll leave fingerprints." The updates came in pieces, delivered in plain manila envelopes and unadorned sentences. Edward had been searching for Ethan's biological father. Not just curiosity. Requests for certified copies of hospital records. Inquiries to county clerks in 2 states. Emails to a private lab about a discrete DNA test for inheritance confirmation. Alvarez included printouts with the names blacked out except for the crucial ones. He wrote in the margin, "Digging for probate." A week later, he called me from a courthouse hallway. I could hear a bailiff telling people to line up. "You should sit down," he said gently. Ethan's biological father had died recently. There was a probate case open in Orange County. The man, no need to say his name, I already knew it like an old bruise, had left a large inheritance, a paid-off house, investment accounts, a life insurance policy. No spouse. No other children listed. Alvarez spoke quietly, like a paramedic reporting vital signs. "If your sister regains custody," he said, "she could claim on behalf of the boy." I could hear paper shuffling through the receiver. "It's significant." For a long moment, I just breathed, counting to 4 like we teach anxious kids in the health office. It felt obscene that grief and money could occupy the same sentence, that a man's death could become a column of figures in a plan that had nothing to do with Ethan's bedtime or his chipped tooth or the green bike helmet he refused to give up. I thought of Rachel's list, the yard, the trips abroad, both parents, and saw it suddenly as a ledger. Debits and credits. A child as asset. I didn't tell Ethan anything about inheritances or probate. I kept our world small and legible. Toast cut into triangles, a note in his lunchbox, the ritual of Friday forts even when my hands shook folding the blankets. I told the school counselor enough so she could watch him gently from afar, and Mr. Ortiz started leaving little notes on our door. "You got this." My parents called twice, each conversation ending with my mother's sigh that sounded like a closing drawer. "Try to be reasonable," she said. "Family should be together." I looked at the laundry basket we used years ago and wanted to say that family is whoever runs toward the crying, not away from it. At night, after Ethan fell asleep, I spread Alvarez's documents on the table and traced the chain of events with a pen cap: search, death, estate, petition. My mind did the cruel math of motive without wanting to. If Rachel regained custody, she would be able to claim part of the estate on behalf of her son. And Edward, the smile like a legal brief, the briefcase on a picnic table, would know exactly how to structure it, how to keep it out of my reach, how to turn love into leverage. I felt outrage and then shame for feeling outrage, as if anger were a luxury. Then I remembered the way Ethan's hand reaches for mine in a crowd, and I let the anger stay. It focused me. And it told me what needed doing. I made copies. I made lists. I made the promises I could keep aloud and the ones I couldn't yet under my breath. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator and the soft snore from the room down the hall. The next step would be war I didn't choose, but I knew what side I was on. The courthouse on Hill Street has a smell I will always recognize: old paper, coffee burned down to tar, the metallic tang of nerves. I wore my clinic slacks and the only blazer I own, hair pulled back in a way that felt like armor. In the elevator, a woman pressed a trembling palm to her chest and whispered, "Please," to no one. I understood. I had been whispering the same word for days. Our case was called mid-morning. The courtroom was all wood and rules. The judge's bench rose like a stage where no one applauds. Rachel sat at counsel table in a crisp blouse that made her look like a brochure. Beside her, Edward arranged his papers with the precision of a man who irons the creases into his arguments. My parents took the row behind them, my mother with a tissue already pinched in her fingers, my father with his jaw set like a verdict he'd selected himself. I sat across the aisle with my binder and the folder that had lived in my top drawer like a beating heart. Rachel's attorney began the performance with a voice pitched to reasonable. He described a stable family and a perfect home, their Westwood townhouse with a secure gate, a quiet courtyard, a spare bedroom waiting as if it had been tenderly empty for years. He said children thrive with two married parents, with structure, with opportunities. Edward nodded at each bullet point like a metronome. My mother dabbed her eyes on cue. My father watched the judge, not me. Then came the strafing run at my life. Rachel's lawyer asked about my salary, line by line, as if humility could be an indictment. He noted the price of my rent. He described my apartment as small and above a laundromat, turning geography into shame. He asked how many square feet Ethan's bedroom was. He asked how often I'd taken him abroad. He raised an eyebrow at school nurse, as if the word nurse shrank when prefaced by school. He said poor relative, without saying it, letting the phrase flap in the air like a flag he didn't have to claim. I answered quietly, truthfully, without apology. No, we hadn't been to Europe. Yes, he shares a wall with my bedroom. Yes, I budget. Yes, I shop sales. Yes, our building hums with the sound of other families surviving. No, I wasn't embarrassed. My parents testified next. My mother's voice shook the way it does when she wants to sound wounded and generous at once. She said I had interfered with their access, that I made it difficult for them to see their grandson. She described me as protective to a fault. My father cleared his throat and delivered the line he'd practiced on me at the dining table. Blood is more important than anything else. Rachel deserves a second chance. He glanced back at Rachel like a man hoping to be graded. When it was my turn, I stood with my binder open to the tabs I'd worn soft. I told the story without embroidery. The carrier on my welcome mat, the note, the laundry basket crib, the night I called the police and learned that abandonment has exceptions if it's wrapped in family. I spoke about the years after, pediatrician appointments, spelling tests, bicycle rides, the kind of routines that knit a childhood together one small seam at a time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at my parents. I kept my eyes on the judge because this was the one person in the room allowed to decide what counted. Then I presented our proof of a life. Letters from teachers, 2 homeroom teachers, and the reading specialist described Ethan as curious, kind, eager to help the new kid find the cafeteria. They noted he stayed after class to untangle a classmate's shoelaces, that he returned library books with sticky notes apologizing for the smudge of jam. The school psychologist wrote about attachment, about how security looks in 9-year-old form, the way he relaxes when I enter a room, the steady upward line of his progress, the absence of red flags where neglect would have planted them. Neighbors wrote about Friday blanket forts, about shared walls that record laughter as much as crying, about the way Ethan says hello to the man who feeds the pigeons and thanks the UPS driver like he's Santa. I submitted photos nobody had seen, Ethan with missing front teeth and a science fair volcano, Ethan on the boardwalk, hair blown straight up, laughing. Rachel's attorney objected to the sentimentality, but the judge accepted the letters. He read enough lines for me to see his eyes soften and sharpen at once. Then he nodded at me, the way people do when they want you to keep going if you can. I could feel my heart counting time as I picked up the last folder, the one that had sat under everything else for weeks, because it was heavier than paper should be. Your Honor, I said, laying it on the evidence table, there is additional information relevant to motive and credibility. Inside were printed emails obtained by the investigator, Edward's correspondence with a private lab about post-mortem DNA confirmation, requests to county clerks for certified records, inquiries to the probate court with Ethan's birth date in the subject line. There was a spreadsheet of Rachel's debts, credit cards at the limits, a personal loan, a payday advance I could hardly look at without remembering a dozen nights I might have been asked instead. And there were screenshots of my mother's texts to Rachel from months and years before the doorbell rang, photos of Ethan I had sent to my parents, forwarded with comments like, "He's getting so big," and "Come back when you're ready." Proof that they had known where she was while telling me they didn't. Edward's joy tightened by degrees as each page slid into the record. Rachel's eyes flashed the way they used to when caught in a lie too complicated to charm her way out of. My mother's tissue froze mid-dab. My father's face went still. The judge leaned back and looked at all of us as if he were taking attendance in a class where no one had done the reading. He tapped the edge of the correspondence with his pen. "There are too many lies in this courtroom," he said finally, voice low enough to make the benches creak with people sitting up straighter. "This is not about money, but about the future of a child." The sentence fell into the room and rearranged it. Rachel folded into herself. Edward stared at a point just beyond me where outcomes live before they're spoken aloud. Closing arguments were brief because there wasn't much left to gild. Rachel's attorney tried to reframe the search for the biological father as diligence and the debts as historical. He said the yard and the passport stamps were opportunities. He said mother like a trump card. My attorney, a woman from legal aid with ink on her fingers and a spine made of tempered wire, pointed to the timeline, to the letters, to the years of ordinary miracles that do not trend. She said best interests so simply that it sounded like something you could hold. The judge took a recess that lasted long enough for me to count the holes in the ceiling tiles. When he returned, he did not waste syllables. He found that Ethan had been in my continuous care since infancy, that he was thriving, that uprooting him would cause harm, that Rachel's recent stability, while commendable, did not erase a decade. That Edward's documented interest in the inheritance undermined their claim to pure motives, that my parents' concealment of contact damaged their credibility as potential guardians. He said the orders out loud with the certainty of a man laying bricks. I was granted sole legal and physical custody. Rachel would receive structured, supervised visitation to begin, with a path to expand if consistency and honesty were demonstrated over time. No relocation without court approval. No unilateral decisions. No using Ethan as a key to any estate without judicial review. The gavel didn't make a dramatic sound. It was more like a firm period at the end of a sentence I had been writing for 10 years. I didn't cry until I felt my hands stop shaking. In the quiet that followed, I heard Rachel's breath hitch and my mother's chair scrape the floor and Edward clear his throat like a man swallowing a loss he had not planned for. I closed my binder, slid the folder back inside, and stood because my legs had decided I could. I looked at the judge and said the only words I could manage. "Thank you." He nodded once, not unkindly, and moved on to the next case, another family unspooling in public. In the hallway, the light felt too bright. People were hugging and not hugging, whispering and not speaking at all. I leaned against the cool marble for a second and let the verdict settle into my bones like heat after cold. Outside, buses sighed and the city kept on being itself. I checked my phone. A message from the school flickered. Ethan had a good day. See you at pickup. I pressed the screen to my chest, not as a prayer, but as proof. After the trial, I did the most ordinary thing I could think of. I took Ethan out for pizza. We went to the place on Colorado with the red vinyl booths and the arcade machine that only eats quarters when someone is watching. He wanted half pepperoni, half pineapple. I ordered mushrooms just to feel like an adult again. We sat across from each other under a neon sign that hummed like a lullaby. He leaned in close to me, eyes shining in the way they do when his whole body is listening. "You promised I could stay with you. And you kept your promise." I felt something unwind inside me, a knot tied so long ago. That night he fell asleep in 7 minutes flat, sprawled sideways, one hand still curled around a plastic stegosaurus. I stood in the doorway and watched his shoulders rise and fall. The binder went back into the drawer, the copies of orders filed in a folder labeled with our names. For the first time in months, I slept through my alarm. In the morning, I made pancakes and burned the first batch, and we laughed like people who suddenly had extra time. The weeks after the ruling were not all soft edges. The court set supervised visitation at a center that looks like a cross between a library and a playroom, beanbags in primary colors, puzzles with missing pieces, a whiteboard with the day's schedule written in bubble letters. A counselor sat close enough to hear, far enough to pretend privacy. Rachel came with her hair pulled back and her hands twisting the strap of her purse. She brought photo albums of herself as a little girl, as if proof of who she had been could bridge the years. At first, Ethan kept one sneaker pressed against my shoe until he remembered he could breathe. While he concentrated on gluing googly eyes to a paper plate, Rachel looked at me and spoke in a single unbroken exhale. I wanted not only my son back, but also complete control over my life. I was wrong. Her voice snagged on the last word and then steadied. I nodded because there are apologies you don't pat on the head. You place them carefully and let them stand. Edward didn't last much longer than the paperwork. He disappeared from her life as soon as he lost interest due to the loss of his promised inheritance. The divorce moved through the courts as impersonally as a bus schedule. Rachel stopped mentioning we and started saying I again. I got a new sponsor. I'm interviewing for a different team. I made it 90 more days. When she arrived on time 3 weeks in a row, the counselor wrote consistency improving in a chart and smiled at both of us like it was a holiday. My parents were angrier than they knew how to say, which meant my mother baked and my father called fewer times but stayed on the phone longer. The new rules were simple and printed in black ink, only limited visits with their grandson, strictly under my supervision. The first one was at our apartment on a Sunday afternoon. I put out sliced apples and pretzels and exactly 3 different board games, like a host for dignitaries from a country where disappointment is treason. My mother arrived with a cake shaped like a soccer ball and the air of someone auditioning for forgiveness. My father carried a gift bag that accidentally revealed a remote control car before Ethan even opened it. We stayed in the lane I painted for us, polite, focused on Ethan, no policy debates disguised as small talk. When my mother started to say, if you had just, I placed my hand flat on the table and said, we aren't doing the past today, and we weren't. Life did what it does best when you let it. It kept going. Ethan played spring soccer and discovered he loved defense because it's like guarding a secret. He learned to make grilled cheese without burning the pan and to sort laundry without turning everything a dignified shade of pink. I kept the counselor updated and kept my promises to show up with snacks at school events. A year later, steady work bore a new kind of fruit. The district promoted me to lead school nurse for our cluster, 3 elementary schools and 1 middle, meaning I trained new nurses, coordinated screenings, and sat at tables where decisions got made about kids like Ethan. The raise wasn't huge, but it was respectable, and the hours kept the rhythm of our life intact. With the back pay from an old step increase and the careful savings of a woman who knows where every dollar lives, I bought a small house with a garden in the Pasadena area. It was a faded craftsman with a porch that slouched and a lemon tree out back that introduced itself first with scent and then with fruit. The inspection report read like a love letter to deferred maintenance, but the bones were good, and the price didn't scare me into silence. Moving day looked like a sitcom that survived on sincerity. Mr. Ortiz came to hold the door and tell the loading guys they were doing it wrong. My colleagues brought sandwiches and a toolbox no one used correctly. Ethan labeled boxes with intense seriousness. The garden was small, 2 raised beds, a strip of soil along the fence, and the lemon tree, but it felt like acreage after years of balcony plants. We planted cherry tomatoes, basil, and a brave strawberry that declined to perform, but still occupied a sunny corner like an optimist. Ethan claimed the south-facing bedroom and taped a solar system to the ceiling. I painted the living room a color that the paint chip had called marshmallow, which turned out to be white with a little forgiveness in it. Rachel kept showing up for her scheduled time. Sometimes she brought a science kit or a book about space. Sometimes she brought nothing but patience. She cried less and laughed more. When she slipped once and called me at midnight from a dark place, I told her the truth. Call your sponsor. Call me in the morning if you made it. In the morning, she texted a picture of sun hitting her kitchen counter and wrote, "Made it." Trust, I learned, is not a gift. It is a layaway plan. As for my parents, they adjusted the way people do when the map changes, but the roads remain. My father taught Ethan to polish his shoes before a school concert. My mother learned to bring snacks instead of opinions. They asked permission before dates. They left when I said time was up. Sometimes my mother stayed an extra minute in the kitchen, pretending to help with dishes, and asked about the lemon tree as if horticulture could be a bridge. And I let it be one. When Ethan turned 11, he wanted a small birthday, 2 friends, a backyard movie on a sheet, hot dogs, and lemonade from our own tree. The boys threw a football until dusk and laughed even when it thudded into the fence. After cake and the last pickup, after the backyard was a confetti of paper plates and grass stains, Ethan ducked into his room and returned with a card he had made from construction paper and tape. He handed it to me without ceremony, like an errand. On the front, he had drawn our house with smoke that looked like speech. Inside, in his careful printing, it said, "A real mother is not the one who gave birth to you, but the one who stayed." I didn't try to speak. I cried tears of joy and hugged him tightly, the kind of hug that makes a body feel like a promise kept. I pressed the card flat between the pages of the binder that once only held orders and evidence. It belonged there, not as proof for a judge, but as proof for me for the nights when fear still grabbed my ankle, for the mornings when the dishwasher broke and the car wouldn't start and the garden flooded the minute I remembered to water it. The house settled around us, old wood exhaling, a new life worn in at the edges. A real family is not about blood, but about choice. And every single day for the past decade, I made that choice. I chose to be a mother to the boy who was once left on my doorstep in the pouring rain, with nothing but a note and a future no one wanted to claim. When I look back now, I realize the story was never about winning a court battle or proving myself to my family. It was about proving something to Ethan and to myself, that I was stronger than they thought. Today, our home in Pasadena is filled with laughter, bikes leaning against the porch, a lemon tree in the backyard, and a boy who knows he is wanted. He calls me mom not because biology tells him to, but because his heart does. So I'll leave you with this question. What do you think is more important, family ties or true love? Have you ever had to defend your boundaries, even against the people who are supposed to protect you? Share your own story in the comments below. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, because your voice, your courage, might be the very thing that gives someone else the strength to stand up to their so-called relatives.